I was 20 years old when I made the worst mistake of my life. One moment of anger, one slap. I apologized. I moved on. I thought it was over. It was not over. Not even close. 10 years later, a woman moved in next door to me. Sweet, kind, familiar somehow. Though I could not place why, I fell in love with her. I married her. We had a son together, and for a while, I believed I had built the perfect life. Then one night, she looked at me with a coldness I will never forget, and she told me the truth. She had planned every single moment of our relationship, from the day she moved in next door, for one reason only: revenge. By the time she was finished with me, I had lost my business, my family, my son, and everything I had spent my entire adult life building. This is the story of how one moment from my past came back, patiently, silently, and destroyed everything I loved. I am not proud of how this story begins, but I need you to understand all of it, so you understand exactly what it cost me. Stay until the end. My name is Ryan Bennett. I am 34 years old now, but this story begins 14 years ago, when I was 20 years old, in my second year of college. I want to be honest with you from the very beginning of this story, because I believe honesty matters, even when it is uncomfortable. What I am about to tell you is not something I am proud of. It is something I have carried with me, with deep regret, for the past 14 years. I grew up in a modest, working-class family. My father drove delivery trucks for a shipping company. My mother worked as a school cafeteria worker. We did not have much money, but we had love, and my parents worked incredibly hard to send me to college, the first person in our family to attend university. I was not always a calm, patient person during those college years. I was young, proud, and, if I am being completely honest, I struggled with controlling my temper when I felt disrespected or humiliated in front of others. This is not an excuse for what I am about to describe. It is simply the truth about who I was at 20 years old. During my second year of college, I was in a required literature class, alongside a young woman named Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was sharp, confident, and, from what I remember of those early interactions, she had a talent for finding exactly the right words to embarrass or provoke someone in front of a group, a skill she seemed to enjoy using, particularly against students she viewed as beneath her socially or academically. I do not say this to justify what happened next. I say it only to give context for a relationship that had already grown tense before the incident that would change both our lives forever. There had been small conflicts between us throughout the semester, disagreements during class discussions, competitive tension around grades, the kind of friction that sometimes develops between two strong-willed young people forced into repeated contact. But nothing had ever escalated beyond words, until one afternoon during a group project presentation, when Vanessa made a comment in front of our entire class about my family, specifically mocking the fact that my mother worked in a school cafeteria. Using this detail, which I had shared in an earlier, more personal class discussion about our family backgrounds, as a cruel joke intended to embarrass me in front of our classmates. I felt something break inside me in that moment, a combination of humiliation, protective anger toward my mother, and, I now recognize, an inability at that young age to process strong emotions in a healthy, controlled way. Without thinking, without any consideration of consequences, I reacted by slapping her across the face, in front of our entire class. I want to be completely clear about something. What I did was wrong. There is no justification, no provocation severe enough that makes physically striking another person acceptable. I understood this immediately, even in the shocked, horrified moment right after it happened, watching Vanessa's hand rise slowly to her cheek, watching the disbelief and pain spread across her face, watching our classmates stare at me in stunned silence. I was immediately reported to the university's disciplinary board. I faced a formal hearing, and given the seriousness of physically striking another student, I was suspended for one full semester, required to complete anger management counseling before returning, and given a formal disciplinary mark on my academic record that nearly cost me my acceptance into several job opportunities years later. I want you to understand, before this story continues, that I did seek out Vanessa afterward, once the disciplinary process concluded, to offer a genuine, direct apology. I found her outside the university library about 2 weeks after the incident, and I told her, as sincerely as I knew how at 20 years old, that what I did was inexcusable, that I took full responsibility, and that I was deeply sorry for the pain and humiliation I had caused her. She listened to my apology in silence, her expression unreadable. When I finished speaking, she said only a few words. "You'll understand someday, Ryan, exactly what it feels like to lose control of everything because of one moment you can't take back." At the time, I interpreted this as simply an angry, hurt response from someone I had wronged. Understandable, given what I had done to her. I did not understand, not for many years, that these words were not simply an emotional reaction. They were a promise. After that semester, Vanessa transferred to a different university, and I did not see or hear from her again for the next 10 years. I completed my degree, worked hard to rebuild my reputation and self-discipline, and eventually built a small but successful landscaping and property maintenance business, employing, by the time this story truly begins, nearly 15 employees across our growing region. I want to be honest that I thought about that moment often over the following decade, the shame of it never fully leaving me, even as I worked to become a better, calmer, more emotionally controlled version of myself. I attended additional counseling voluntarily in my mid-20s, worked seriously on understanding and managing my anger, and genuinely believed, by the time I turned 30, that I had grown into a fundamentally different, better person than the 20-year-old who had lost control that afternoon in a college classroom. I never imagined that this single moment from my past, a moment I had spent a decade trying to learn from and move beyond, would eventually return to destroy everything I had built. 10 years after the incident at college, I was 30 years old, successfully running my landscaping business, and living in a comfortable house I had purchased 3 years earlier in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I was single at the time, having ended a long relationship about a year earlier, focusing primarily on growing my business and rebuilding my personal life at a comfortable, unhurried pace. One spring afternoon, I noticed a moving truck parked outside the house next door, previously occupied by an elderly couple who had recently moved to be closer to their children in another state. Being naturally friendly with my neighbors, I walked over later that day to introduce myself to whoever had purchased the house. The woman who answered the door introduced herself as Vanessa Coleman. I remember feeling a brief flicker of familiarity looking at her face, something about her eyes, her smile, that seemed to tug at a distant memory, but I dismissed it quickly, assuming I simply reminded myself of someone from the many people I had encountered over the years in a bustling university and later professional life. I want to explain something important here. Vanessa had changed considerably since our college years, both in appearance and, apparently, in the name she used, having legally changed her last name from Cole to Coleman, her mother's maiden name, several years after our college days, for reasons I would not fully understand until much later in this story. Combined with a decade of natural physical changes and a considerably different personal style than she had in college, I did not immediately recognize her as the same young woman I had wronged so significantly 10 years earlier. Vanessa, however, as I would eventually learn, recognized me immediately. Over the following weeks, our interactions as neighbors began naturally and pleasantly. She would wave when I left for work in the mornings. We occasionally chatted briefly while collecting mail or working in our respective yards. She mentioned that she worked as a marketing consultant, recently relocated to our area after several years working internationally, though I would later learn that significant portions of this professional background were carefully fabricated to support the elaborate plan she had been constructing. I found myself genuinely drawn to her during these early interactions. She was warm, engaging, seemingly interested in my life and my business, asking thoughtful questions and remembering small details from our conversations, qualities that felt refreshing after the emotional distance that had characterized the end of my previous relationship. About 2 months after she moved in, we shared our first proper date, initially framed casually as neighbors getting to know each other better over dinner, but which quickly developed into something more serious. I want to be honest that during this early period of our relationship, I experienced genuine happiness, genuine connection, feelings I had not experienced so strongly in my previous relationships. I did not yet know that every conversation, every shared laugh, every carefully placed detail about her supposed background and interests had been meticulously researched and planned in advance, designed specifically to appeal to exactly the kind of partner I would find irresistible, based on information she had apparently gathered about me through social media, mutual acquaintances, and even, as I would eventually discover, direct surveillance of my daily routines before she ever moved into the house next door. This realization, when it eventually came, would prove to be one of the most disturbing aspects of everything that followed. This was not a chance encounter between former college acquaintances who happened to reconnect years later. This was a calculated, deliberate infiltration of my life, planned meticulously over what I would later learn was nearly 2 full years of preparation before she ever knocked on my door as my new neighbor. Our relationship progressed relatively quickly over the following year. Vanessa, or as I still knew her at the time, seemed to fit seamlessly into every aspect of my life. She got along well with my closest friends. She charmed my parents completely during her first visit to meet them, my mother in particular commenting afterward how genuinely happy she was to see me finally settling into a relationship with someone who seemed to appreciate and support me so completely. I proposed to her after 14 months of dating, during a weekend trip to a coastal town we had visited together several times throughout our relationship. She cried when I asked. Tears that I believed, completely, were tears of genuine joy and love. We married 8 months later, in a modest but beautiful ceremony, attended by both our families and close friends. I want to describe our wedding day honestly, because it represents, in many ways, the peak of the happiness I experienced during this entire relationship. Happiness, I now understand, was built entirely on a foundation of calculated deception, though I felt none of that deception in the moment itself. Vanessa's family attended the wedding as well, including her mother, a quiet, somewhat reserved woman who I would later learn had actually encouraged and supported Vanessa's plan from very early in its development, having apparently harbored her own significant resentment toward me over the years, believing, as Vanessa did, that the disciplinary consequences I faced in college had been insufficient punishment for what I had done to her daughter. About a year into our marriage, Vanessa told me she was pregnant. I remember this moment vividly, one of the purest moments of joy I have ever experienced in my life. We had discussed starting a family early in our relationship, and I had genuinely looked forward to becoming a father, to building the kind of stable, loving family life that I had always valued, having grown up within my own parents' modest but genuinely happy household. Our son, whom we named Ethan, was born the following spring. I remember holding him for the first time in the hospital, overwhelmed with love and protective instinct, promising myself silently that I would be the best father possible, that I would give him every opportunity and every ounce of love and support that I could provide. For the first 2 years of Ethan's life, our family life seemed, from every outward appearance, genuinely happy and stable. I continued growing my landscaping business successfully. Vanessa, who had stopped working as a marketing consultant after Ethan's birth, seemed content managing our household and caring for our son, though looking back now, I recognize small signs during this period that I dismissed at the time, moments of unexplained distance or coldness that would occasionally surface before quickly disappearing behind her usual warm, engaged demeanor. I did not know, during these seemingly happy years, that Vanessa was carefully documenting, recording, and in some cases, deliberately manufacturing evidence designed to eventually support a very different narrative about our marriage than the genuinely loving relationship I believed we shared. Looking back now, I can identify several moments during those early years of our marriage where something felt subtly wrong, moments I dismissed at the time because I could not imagine, even for a second, that my wife was secretly building a case against me, a case that would eventually be used to destroy my relationship with our son and everything else I had built. I remember Vanessa occasionally asking me questions that felt oddly specific, questions about old friendships from college, about whether I had ever struggled with controlling my temper as an adult, about how I generally handled stress or frustration at work with my employees. At the time, I interpreted these conversations as normal marital curiosity, A spouse simply wanting to understand my history and personality more deeply, I answered honestly, including, on more than one occasion, openly discussing the incident from college, the slap, my suspension, the counseling I had voluntarily pursued afterward to address my anger, believing completely that sharing this vulnerable, difficult part of my past with my wife represented healthy openness and trust within our marriage. I did not know, when I shared these details, that Vanessa already knew every detail of that incident far more intimately than I did, having lived through it herself as the person I had struck. I did not know that these seemingly innocent conversations were actually careful information-gathering sessions, designed to help her construct an eventual narrative, one that would paint our entire marriage as characterized by hidden anger and controlling behavior, using my own honest, vulnerable admissions as supporting evidence. There were other small moments too, moments that felt strange in isolation, but which I never connected into any coherent pattern until much later. I noticed occasionally that Vanessa would record video on her phone during ordinary household disagreements, moments of normal marital friction, disagreements about finances, or scheduling conflicts, or minor parenting decisions, the kind of everyday tension that exists within any genuine, functioning marriage. When I asked why she was recording, she would explain casually that she was simply taking a video to send to a friend, or documenting something for insurance purposes, explanations that seemed reasonable enough at the time to avoid raising any serious suspicion. I did not understand that she was carefully curating a collection of footage, capturing moments of raised voices, frustrated tone, or heated disagreement, footage that, when later presented completely out of context, without the full conversation or resolution that typically followed these minor disputes, could be used to construct a misleading narrative about the true nature of our relationship. About 18 months after Ethan's birth, I began noticing a more significant shift in Vanessa's behavior. She became increasingly critical of small aspects of my parenting, moments that had never previously seemed to concern her. If I raised my voice even slightly, perhaps out of normal parental frustration during a difficult moment with a tired, crying toddler, she would react with visible alarm, sometimes stepping between Ethan and me in ways that felt increasingly dramatic compared to the genuine severity of whatever minor frustration I had actually expressed. I remember one particular evening when Ethan was about 2 years old, going through a difficult phase of nighttime tantrums that left both Vanessa and me exhausted and frustrated. During one particularly difficult night, after nearly an hour of attempting to calm our overtired, crying son, I raised my voice, not toward Ethan directly, but in frustrated exhaustion, saying something like, "I can't do this every single night. Something has to change." Vanessa immediately picked up Ethan, moving him away from me with an expression of alarm that, looking back now, seemed disproportionate to what had actually occurred. A tired father expressing normal parental frustration after an exhausting evening, not any genuine threat or danger toward our son. At the time, I apologized for raising my voice, genuinely concerned that I had upset her, never imagining that this moment, and others like it, were being carefully noted and remembered, pieces being assembled for a case I did not yet know was being built against me. Around this same period, I began noticing that Vanessa was spending considerably more time in private phone conversations, often stepping into another room or outside when her phone rang. Conversations she would later explain vaguely as work-related calls from her previous marketing career, despite having told me she had fully stepped away from that profession after Ethan's birth. I did not push these explanations very hard, trusting, as I always had throughout our relationship, that my wife was being honest with me about her activities and communications. I did not know that these calls were actually regular check-ins with a family law attorney Vanessa had quietly retained nearly a year earlier, an attorney who specialized in custody disputes and who was helping her carefully plan exactly how and when to execute the next phase of what I would eventually understand was a meticulously constructed plan, years in the making, to not only leave our marriage, but to do so in a way that would maximize the devastation inflicted upon me, taking our son, our shared assets, and my reputation, along with her departure. There is one particular weekend, about 4 months before Vanessa finally revealed the truth to me, that I have replayed countless times in my memory since then, wondering what might have been different had I paid closer attention to what was happening right in front of me. Vanessa's mother, a woman named Diane Cole, had come to visit us for a long weekend, ostensibly to spend time with her grandson. I had always maintained a polite, if somewhat distant relationship with Diane throughout our marriage, sensing occasionally a certain reserved coolness in how she interacted with me, though I had always attributed this simply to her generally quiet, private personality, rather than anything more significant. During this particular visit, I walked into our kitchen late one evening to find Vanessa and her mother in the middle of a hushed, intense conversation that stopped abruptly the moment they noticed my presence. I remember Diane's expression in that moment, a mixture of what looked like concern and something almost like guilt, quickly replaced by a forced, casual smile as she asked whether I wanted a cup of tea. I asked, lightly, what they had been discussing so intently, and Vanessa explained smoothly that her mother had simply been sharing some difficult news about a health scare involving an old family friend, a story that, at the time, seemed entirely plausible and reasonable, explaining the serious tone I had walked in on. Later that same weekend, I noticed Diane watching me with unusual attentiveness during a family dinner, her eyes occasionally following my interactions with Ethan, with what I now understand, looking back, was likely a combination of genuine affection for her grandson and considerable internal conflict about the plan she knew her daughter was actively executing against me. I would later learn, through limited testimony during our custody proceedings, that Diane had known about Vanessa's plan for revenge from a very early stage, having provided both emotional support and some practical assistance during the years of preparation, though she apparently expressed growing discomfort as the plan progressed closer to its execution, particularly once Ethan was born and became, in her words during a brief moment of testimony, an innocent person caught in the middle of something that was never about him. This complicated involvement from Vanessa's own mother added another painful layer to my eventual understanding of everything that had happened. It was not simply my wife who had deceived me for years. It was, in some meaningful sense, an entire extended family unit that had known, to varying degrees, about the true nature of our relationship, while I remained completely unaware, trusting not only my wife but her mother as well, believing we were building genuine, extended family bonds together, when in reality, at least part of that extended family had been quietly aware of the elaborate deception unfolding around me. I do not know, even now, exactly how Diane ultimately felt about her role in everything that happened. Our relationship, understandably, ended entirely following the divorce, and I have had no direct contact with her since Vanessa's revelation that night in our kitchen. I sometimes wonder whether her visible discomfort during that final weekend visit represented a genuine, growing moral conflict about the plan she had helped support, or simply nervousness about maintaining the deception successfully until its planned conclusion. I suppose I will never fully know the answer to that particular question. The night that changed everything happened when Ethan was almost 3 years old. I remember the date clearly because it fell just 2 days after our 5th wedding anniversary, an anniversary we had celebrated, or so I believed at the time, with what seemed like genuine warmth and affection between us. I came home from work later than usual that evening, having stayed late to finish an urgent landscaping contract for a commercial client. When I walked into our house, I immediately sensed something was different. Ethan was not in his usual spot in the living room, and I found a note from Vanessa explaining that she had taken him to stay with her mother for a few days, without any prior discussion or explanation. I called her immediately, confused and concerned, and she answered on the second ring, her voice carrying a coldness I had genuinely never heard from her before in our entire 5 years together. "Ryan," she said, "we need to talk. I think it's time you finally understand what's actually been happening." She agreed to meet me at our house later that evening, after arranging for Ethan to stay overnight with her mother. When she arrived, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we had shared thousands of ordinary family meals together, she began speaking with a calm, almost detached clarity that felt deeply unsettling. "Do you remember college, Ryan?" she asked. "Do you remember the day you slapped me in front of our entire class?" I felt my stomach drop immediately. a wave of confusion and dawning horror beginning to spread through my chest. "Vanessa, what does that have to do with—" "I'm not Vanessa Coleman," she interrupted calmly. "Or I am, legally, now. But you knew me first, as Vanessa Cole. I changed my last name years ago, after everything that happened, after my scholarship was revoked because of the disciplinary investigation that followed what you did to me, after my own family struggled to understand and accept the humiliation I experienced, both from what you did and from how publicly it was discussed throughout our entire university afterward." I sat frozen, staring at my wife, feeling the entire foundation of my understanding about our marriage beginning to crumble in real time. "I never forgot what you said to me outside the library," I said quietly, my voice barely steady. "I never forgot how sorry I was." "Sorry doesn't undo what happened, Ryan," she said, her voice still eerily calm. "You destroyed something in me that day, something that took years to even begin to heal from. And when I finally did heal, when I finally rebuilt myself into someone strong again, I made a decision. I decided that you would understand, fully and completely, exactly what it feels like to lose everything you've built because of a single moment you can't take back." I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes, a mixture of fear, betrayal, and dawning understanding of the magnitude of what she was telling me. "You planned this? All of this? Our relationship, our marriage, our son, all of it was just revenge?" "I researched you for nearly 2 years before I ever moved in next door," she said, her voice finally carrying a hint of emotion, though whether it was satisfaction, remaining anger, or something more complicated, I could not tell in that moment. "I learned everything about your life, your business, your friendships, your family. I planned exactly how to make you fall in love with me, exactly what qualities and interests to present that would make me irresistible to you. I moved in next door deliberately, timing it carefully around when I knew your previous relationship had ended." I sat in stunned, horrified silence as she continued, methodically, almost clinically, explaining years of careful planning and calculated manipulation, describing how she had recorded selective footage of our arguments, how she had quietly gathered testimony from friends and acquaintances about moments of frustration or raised voices she had specifically provoked or exaggerated over the years, how she had retained a family law attorney nearly a year earlier to begin building a formal custody case against me, using my own honestly shared history from college, combined with carefully curated evidence from our marriage, to construct a narrative portraying me as someone with a pattern of uncontrolled anger and potential danger to our son. "You can't actually believe this will work," I said, my voice shaking now with a mixture of grief and rising anger. "I've been a good father. I've been a good husband. Everyone who knows us, our friends, our families, they all know the truth about who I actually am." "Perception matters more than truth in family court, Ryan," she said, her voice hardening again. "And I've spent years making sure the perception favors me completely. You'll understand very soon exactly how thoroughly I've prepared for this moment." She stood up from the table, gathering a folder of documents she had brought with her. Documents I would later understand contained the initial formal filing for divorce, full custody of Ethan, and a restraining order request based on the carefully constructed narrative she had spent years preparing. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning," she said, standing in our kitchen doorway, looking back at me one final time. "And I'm filing for full custody of Ethan, along with a protective order based on your documented history of violence and anger issues. You'll have an opportunity to respond through the court process, but I think you'll find, once everything is presented, that the outcome is already fairly certain." She left our house that evening, and I did not see her again in person for nearly 3 weeks, communicating only through lawyers as the formal legal process she had so carefully prepared began moving forward against me. I hired a family law attorney named Marcus Webb almost immediately after Vanessa's formal filing arrived at my door, delivered by a process server just 2 days after our conversation in the kitchen. Marcus had a reputation as a skilled, experienced attorney within our local family court system, and from our very first meeting, he was honest with me about the seriousness of the situation I was facing. "Ryan," he said, reviewing the initial documents Vanessa's attorney had filed, "I won't sugarcoat this for you. This is an extremely well-prepared case. Whoever helped her build this filing spent significant time and effort constructing a detailed narrative, and unfortunately, family court judges tend to take documented histories of violence, even from years in the past, very seriously when determining custody arrangements, especially when combined with more recent supporting evidence. I explained everything to Marcus, the full truth about the college incident, about my genuine remorse, and the counseling I had voluntarily completed, about the recorded arguments that had been taken out of context, about Vanessa's own admission of a years-long, deliberately planned revenge scheme. Marcus listened carefully, taking detailed notes throughout our conversation. "This is important information, Ryan, and we'll use it," he said. "But I need you to understand something crucial. Even if we can eventually prove that Vanessa deliberately orchestrated this entire situation as calculated revenge, that doesn't necessarily erase the underlying facts she's presenting. Your college incident actually happened, and the recorded footage, even if taken out of context, does show real moments of raised voices and frustration within your marriage." Family court proceedings often move cautiously when there's any documented history of anger or aggression, prioritizing what they perceive as child safety above almost every other consideration. Over the following months, our case moved slowly through the family court system. Vanessa's attorney, a sharp, aggressive litigator named Patricia Vance, presented the carefully curated evidence methodically during each hearing. The college disciplinary records, several selectively edited video clips showing me raising my voice during household disagreements, and testimony from a few acquaintances Vanessa had cultivated over the years who described me, based on limited, carefully framed interactions, as someone with a noticeably quick temper. Marcus worked diligently to counter this narrative, presenting character witnesses from among my closest friends and family, documentation of my voluntary counseling completed over a decade earlier, and testimony from my own mother and father, describing the genuinely loving, patient father they had witnessed me become with Ethan throughout his young life. We also attempted, though with limited success, to introduce evidence of Vanessa's deliberate, years-long planning as relevant context for the court to consider. However, Patricia Vance argued successfully, in most instances, that Vanessa's underlying motivations for eventually leaving the marriage, however calculated or premeditated, did not change the factual reality of the evidence being presented regarding actual incidents that had occurred within our household. "The court isn't here to judge why your wife chose to leave you, Mr. Bennett," the presiding judge explained during one particularly difficult hearing, "or what her original intentions may have been when your relationship began. The court's primary concern is determining what arrangement best serves your son's safety and well-being moving forward, based on the documented evidence and testimony presented." This distinction, one that essentially separated Vanessa's calculated motivations from the court's evaluation of the actual evidence presented, became the central, devastating challenge throughout our entire legal battle. Even when Marcus successfully demonstrated, through phone records and limited testimony from Vanessa's own mother, who eventually expressed some discomfort with how far her daughter's plan had progressed, that significant premeditation had gone into constructing this situation, the court remained focused primarily on the surface-level evidence, rather than the deeper context surrounding it. After nearly 8 months of increasingly painful legal proceedings, the court issued its final custody determination. Vanessa was granted primary physical custody of Ethan, with me receiving limited, supervised visitation rights, along with a formal requirement that I complete additional anger management counseling and demonstrate consistent, documented behavioral change over an extended period before any expansion of visitation privileges would be considered. I remember sitting in that courtroom, listening to the judge read this final determination, feeling an overwhelming, crushing grief unlike anything I had experienced before in my entire life. My son, the child I had loved and cared for since the moment of his birth, would now spend only a handful of supervised hours with me each month, based largely on evidence constructed through years of deliberate manipulation and calculated deception. I want to describe one particular hearing in detail because it represents, more than any other moment in this entire ordeal, exactly how effectively Vanessa's years of preparation had positioned her for this legal battle. During the 4th major hearing in our custody case, Patricia Vance presented a piece of video evidence that I had genuinely forgotten existed. recorded almost 2 years before Vanessa ever revealed her true intentions to me. The footage showed a moment from Ethan's first birthday party, when I had briefly raised my voice at a family friend's teenage son, who had accidentally knocked over and broken a small decoration I had spent considerable time setting up that morning. In the actual moment, this had been a brief, minor flash of frustration, quickly followed by an apology to the embarrassed teenager, and the party had continued normally within minutes, with no lasting tension or conflict remaining afterward. But the video clip Patricia Vance presented in court captured only the raised voice itself, roughly 15 seconds of footage, carefully edited to remove any context of what preceded or followed the moment, presented instead, alongside testimony, suggesting this represented a broader pattern of unpredictable anger occurring even during supposedly happy family occasions. I remember sitting beside Marcus as this footage played in the courtroom, watching several of the judge's expressions shift subtly as she observed the video, understanding immediately how damaging this kind of carefully selected, context-free evidence could be, even when it represented such a small, ultimately harmless moment within the actual reality of that day. Marcus worked to counter this specific piece of evidence during cross-examination, calling the family friend whose son had been involved in the original incident to testify about the full context, the immediate apology, the continued friendly relationship between our families following that day. This testimony helped somewhat, but Marcus explained to me afterward that these individual counterarguments, however truthful and important, often struggled to fully overcome the visceral, immediate impact of actually watching video footage showing raised voices and visible frustration, regardless of the broader context eventually provided. "This is exactly why Vanessa's preparation was so effective, Ryan," Marcus told me during a break in proceedings. "She wasn't fabricating evidence from nothing. She was taking real moments that exist within literally every family and every marriage, and presenting them with such careful selectivity and framing that they create an impression far more severe than the actual reality ever was." This particular hearing, more than any other single moment during our extended legal battle, helped me understand the true sophistication of what Vanessa had constructed. She had not needed to invent false incidents entirely. She simply needed to patiently collect, over several years, the ordinary, minor moments of frustration that exist within any genuine family life, and present them, stripped of context and resolution, in a way that constructed an entirely misleading narrative about who I actually was as a husband and father. The custody ruling, devastating as it was, marked only the beginning of what I would eventually lose over the following 2 years. News of the divorce and custody proceedings, given the somewhat public nature of family court records in our state, gradually spread through our small community. Despite my attorney's efforts to maintain some privacy around the details, enough information became known locally that my professional reputation began suffering significant damage. Several long-standing clients of my landscaping business, upon hearing rumors about documented anger issues and a contentious, damaging custody battle, quietly began taking their business elsewhere, uncomfortable it seemed, continuing to work with someone whose personal life had become associated, however unfairly, with allegations of anger and potential instability. Within 18 months following the custody ruling, my business had lost nearly 40% of its previous client base, forcing me to lay off several loyal, long-time employees who had worked with me for years, a painful consequence that extended the damage of this entire situation beyond just my immediate family, into the lives of people who had depended on steady employment through my company. My relationship with my own parents, while never broken entirely, became strained under the weight of watching their son endure this devastating situation. My mother, in particular, struggling with guilt, believing, mistakenly, that the original college incident, which had involved a comment about her own job, somehow made her indirectly responsible for the eventual chain of events that unfolded years later. I spent considerable time reassuring her that nothing about this outcome was her fault, that the choices made, both my own choice to slap Vanessa years earlier and her own subsequent choice to construct such an elaborate, damaging revenge plan, belonged entirely to the two of us, not to anyone else within our families. My relationship with Ethan, limited now to supervised monthly visits lasting only a few hours each time, became a source of profound, ongoing grief throughout this period. I watched my son grow from a toddler into a young child during these brief, supervised interactions, missing countless ordinary moments, bedtimes, morning routines, small daily conversations that most fathers experience without a second thought, moments that had been stolen from me through years of calculated deception I never could have anticipated or prevented. I want to be honest that during this period, I struggled significantly with depression and anger of my own, emotions I worked hard, with the help of continued professional counseling, to process in healthy, controlled ways, determined not to allow this devastating situation to push me back into the same lack of emotional control that had started this entire chain of events so many years earlier during my college years. Vanessa, for her part, seemed to achieve exactly the outcome she had spent years carefully planning. She eventually remarried, about 2 years after our divorce finalized, to a man I never met personally, and continued raising Ethan primarily within her own household, with my role reduced to increasingly infrequent, though gradually less restricted, visitation as the years passed, and I continued demonstrating consistent compliance with the court's requirements. I never received any further direct communication from Vanessa beyond what was strictly necessary through our respective attorneys regarding custody arrangements and logistics. The kitchen conversation on the night she revealed her true intentions remained, for many years, the last genuinely honest conversation we ever had. The 2 years following the custody ruling were, without question, the most difficult period of my entire life. I want to describe honestly what this rebuilding process looked like, because I believe it matters for anyone watching who may be facing their own version of devastating loss, whether through family betrayal, business failure, or simply the consequences of past mistakes catching up with them in unexpected ways. I made a decision, about 6 months after the final custody ruling, that I needed to fundamentally rebuild my life from the ground up, rather than simply trying to return to exactly what I had before. I sold my remaining business assets, downsizing significantly from the 15-employee operation I had once run, to a much smaller, more manageable landscaping company focused on residential clients rather than the larger commercial contracts that had previously required extensive staff and equipment. This downsizing, while painful given how hard I had worked to build the larger business over the previous decade, actually provided an unexpected benefit. With fewer obligations and a more manageable workload, I found myself with considerably more mental and emotional energy to focus on the aspects of my life that truly mattered most, particularly my ongoing, if limited, relationship with Ethan and my own continued personal growth and healing. I continued attending counseling regularly throughout this period, working not only on the anger management requirements mandated by the court, but on processing the profound grief and betrayal I had experienced through Vanessa's calculated revenge. My counselor, a thoughtful, patient woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, helped me understand something important during this period, something that would eventually shape how I approach the remainder of this difficult chapter in my life. "Ryan," she said during one particularly difficult session, "you made a serious mistake 10 years before any of this began, and you've spent a decade genuinely working to become a better person because of it. What Vanessa did to you doesn't erase the reality of your original mistake, but it also doesn't mean you deserve to have your entire life systematically destroyed as calculated punishment, years after you had already faced consequences and genuinely changed. Both things can be true simultaneously. You can hold responsibility for your past mistake, while also recognizing the genuine injustice of what was done to you afterward." This perspective, while not erasing the pain of everything I had lost, helped me eventually find a way forward that did not require choosing between guilt over my past mistake and legitimate grief over the manipulation and loss I had experienced as an adult. I also made a deliberate effort during this period to rebuild trust and stability within my remaining relationships. I spent considerable time reconnecting with old friends who had remained supportive throughout the divorce and custody proceedings, friendships that, in many cases, grew stronger through the shared experience of watching me navigate such a difficult period, with, I hope, some measure of grace and continued personal growth, rather than bitterness or further destructive behavior. I also focused heavily on demonstrating consistent, reliable presence during my limited supervised visitation time with Ethan. Even though our time together remained restricted, I made every single scheduled visit without exception, arriving early, fully present, and engaged during our time together, working hard to build genuine connection and trust despite the limited hours available to us each month. The court-appointed supervisor who oversaw many of these early visits, a kind, professional woman named Rebecca Hughes, eventually became an important advocate in my gradual case for expanded visitation rights, documenting consistently, over many months, my patient, loving, appropriately controlled interactions with my son, evidence that would eventually help demonstrate to the court my genuine, sustained fitness as a father, separate from the events of years past. I want to describe what those early supervised visits actually felt like, because I believe the specific, ordinary details matter more than any general summary could convey. Each supervised visit took place in a small, brightly decorated room at a family services center about 20 minutes from my house, a room designed to feel welcoming for young children, filled with toys, children's books, and a small table where families could sit together during their limited time. Rebecca Hughes, or occasionally another rotating supervisor from the same organization, would sit quietly in the corner of the room throughout our entire visit, taking periodic notes, present as a constant, necessary reminder of exactly how far my relationship with my own son had been reduced. The visits themselves lasted only 2 hours, scheduled once every 2 weeks during the first year following the custody ruling. I remember counting down the days between each visit, with an intensity that is difficult to fully describe, unless you have experienced something similar yourself. The way 2 weeks could feel simultaneously endless while waiting, and impossibly brief once the actual visit began, the 2 hours passing in what felt like mere minutes, before Rebecca would gently announce that our time together had ended for that session. Ethan, still very young during these early visits, barely 2 years old when they began, did not fully understand the unusual nature of our limited time together. To him, in those early months, this arrangement was simply normal, the only version of a relationship with his father he had ever known. This realization, that my own son might grow up believing this restricted, supervised arrangement represented a normal father-son relationship, became one of the most painful aspects of this entire period for me. I made a deliberate decision during these visits to focus entirely on being fully present, setting aside any grief or anger about the broader situation during our actual time together, wanting Ethan's experience of these visits to be filled with genuine warmth, play, and connection, rather than sensing any of the underlying tension or sadness I carried throughout the rest of my daily life. I remember one particular visit, when Ethan was about 2.5 years old, when he looked up at me while we were building a small block tower together, and said simply, "Daddy, why do we always play in this room?" I remember the careful, measured response I gave him in that moment. Something simple and age-appropriate about how sometimes families have special visiting rooms, deliberately avoiding any language that might burden him with the complicated, painful reality behind that arrangement. Rebecca Hughes, sitting in her corner of the room, later told me privately that moments like this, watching me carefully protect Ethan from the emotional weight of our situation, while still maintaining genuine warmth and connection during our limited time, were exactly the kind of evidence that would eventually help demonstrate my consistent fitness as a father to the court reviewing our case. I share these details not for sympathy, but because I believe it is important for anyone who might someday find themselves navigating a similarly restricted relationship with their own child, whether through custody disputes, family conflict, or other painful circumstances, to understand that even within severely limited circumstances, it remains possible to build genuine, meaningful connection, patiently, consistently, one supervised visit at a time, even when the surrounding situation feels overwhelmingly unfair and painful. About 3 years after the initial custody ruling, based on my consistent compliance with all court requirements, completed additional counseling documentation, and the positive, sustained testimony from supervised visitation professionals, my attorney filed a formal request for modified custody arrangements, seeking expanded, unsupervised visitation time with Ethan, who was now approaching 6 years old. This process, while still emotionally difficult, unfolded quite differently than our original custody battle. Vanessa, perhaps having achieved the core outcome she originally sought through her years of calculated planning, did not fight this modification request nearly as aggressively as she had fought the original proceedings. The court, reviewing my consistent record of compliance and the positive documentation from professional supervisors, granted expanded, unsupervised visitation rights, allowing me regular weekend time with my son for the first time in nearly 3 years. I remember the first unsupervised weekend I spent with Ethan, following this modification, feeling an overwhelming mixture of joy and lingering grief. Joy at finally having genuine, private time with my son again. Grief for the years of ordinary, everyday moments that had already been lost. Moments I could never fully recover, no matter how much progress we made moving forward. Ethan, now old enough to form his own memories and understanding of our relationship, gradually developed genuine warmth and connection with me during these expanded visits, developing, over the following years, a relationship that, while different from what might have existed without the interruption caused by Vanessa's revenge scheme, still grew into something meaningful and genuinely loving between father and son. I want to address something directly here, something I have thought about extensively in the years since these events unfolded. I do not believe in seeking further revenge against Vanessa for what she did to me. I considered, during the darkest period following our divorce, various ways I might expose her deliberate manipulation more publicly, potentially damaging her own reputation and relationships the way mine had been damaged. Ultimately, I decided against pursuing this path, not because I believed she did not deserve accountability for her actions, but because I recognized that continuing to focus my energy on revenge or further conflict would only continue harming Ethan, who deserved, regardless of his parents' complicated history, the opportunity to maintain healthy, stable relationships with both of us without being caught in an ongoing cycle of retaliation and conflict. This decision, choosing to focus on rebuilding my relationship with my son and my own personal life rather than pursuing further conflict with Vanessa, represents, I believe, a different kind of justice than the dramatic, satisfying confrontations often featured in stories like this one. It is a quieter, more difficult form of justice, one built through patient consistency, genuine personal growth, and prioritizing my son's well-being above my own desire for vindication or retribution. As Ethan grew older, eventually reaching an age where he began asking more direct questions about our family's history, I faced a difficult decision about how much truth to share with him and when. When Ethan turned 8, during a quiet evening at my house after dinner, he asked me directly why he had spent his early years visiting me, only in that special room with the toys, a memory he had apparently retained more clearly than I realized, despite how young he had been during those supervised visits. I spoke with Dr. Chen extensively before this conversation, seeking guidance on how to answer honestly without burdening my young son with details that might damage his relationship with his mother, a relationship I believed remained important for his overall well-being and development, regardless of everything that had happened between Vanessa and me as adults. I ultimately told Ethan a carefully considered, age-appropriate version of the truth. I explained that when he was very young, his mother and I had some serious disagreements about how our family should be arranged, disagreements that took time and the help of a court to work through properly, and that the special visiting room had simply been part of that process while things were being carefully sorted out. I told him that both his mother and I loved him completely, and that whatever difficulties existed between the two of us as adults had nothing to do with anything he had done, and everything about our current stable, loving arrangement reflected how much we both wanted him to feel secure and cared for. Ethan listened carefully, asked a few follow-up questions about whether Vanessa and I had ever loved each other. Questions I answered honestly, telling him that yes, we had loved each other very much when we were first married, and that some of the happiest moments of my life involved him being born and those first years we spent together as a family, even though things became complicated later on. I made a deliberate choice, during this conversation and in the years since, not to share the full details of Vanessa's calculated revenge plan with Ethan, believing that this information, however true, would serve primarily to damage his relationship with his mother without providing him any genuine benefit as a still-developing child. I have sometimes wondered whether, as an adult, Ethan might someday learn this fuller truth, perhaps even through a story like this one, and I have made peace with that possibility, trusting that by the time he might encounter such information, he will have developed enough maturity and life experience to process it thoughtfully, understanding both his mother's genuine pain from our shared college history and the complicated, difficult consequences that emerged from how she eventually chose to respond to that pain. I share this final piece of our story because I believe it represents something important about the long, complicated aftermath of family betrayal. An aftermath that does not end simply with legal proceedings or dramatic confrontations, but continues quietly, patiently, through countless small decisions about honesty, protection, and love, made over years, as children grow and eventually develop their own understanding of the complicated adults who raised them. Today, Ethan is 9 years old. We maintain a close, loving relationship, splitting time relatively evenly between my household and Vanessa's, following further custody modifications over the years, as both Ethan and our respective circumstances continued evolving. My relationship with Vanessa herself remains distant and strictly practical, focused entirely on necessary co-parenting logistics, without any of the warmth or connection that once characterized our marriage, understandably, given everything that transpired between us. My landscaping business has gradually rebuilt itself over the years, not to the scale it once reached before this crisis unfolded, but to a stable, sustainable size that allows me genuine flexibility to prioritize my relationship with Ethan alongside my professional responsibilities. I think often about the lessons this experience has taught me, lessons I hope might genuinely help others watching this story, particularly anyone who recognizes uncomfortable similarities to their own past mistakes or current relationships. The most important lesson, one I return to constantly, involves the profound, sometimes unpredictable consequences that can follow moments of lost emotional control, even years after those moments have seemingly passed and been addressed through genuine remorse and personal growth. I do not say this to suggest that everyone who makes a serious mistake in their youth will eventually face calculated, elaborate revenge the way I did. Vanessa's response, however understandable her underlying pain may have been, represented an extreme, unusually premeditated reaction that most people who experience similar harm do not pursue. But I do believe there is a broader lesson here about the lasting weight of our actions, particularly moments involving anger or harm toward others. Actions that can echo forward through years or even decades in ways we cannot always predict or control. This understanding has made me even more committed, in the years since these events, to modeling calm, controlled emotional responses for Ethan, hoping to help him develop healthier tools for managing frustration and anger than I possessed at his current age, tools I only developed myself through painful, difficult experience. I also learned, through this entire ordeal, about the complicated nature of accountability and forgiveness, both giving and receiving them. I have had to find a way to hold genuine accountability for my original mistake in college, without allowing that accountability to become an excuse for accepting unlimited additional harm inflicted upon me years later, after I had already worked seriously to become a better, more emotionally controlled person. I have also had to find my own path towards something resembling forgiveness. Not necessarily forgiveness that excuses or minimizes what Vanessa did, but a kind of forgiveness that allows me to release some of the anger and bitterness I carried for years following our divorce, recognizing that continuing to hold on to that anger primarily harmed my own ongoing healing and my ability to be fully present for Ethan, rather than meaningfully affecting Vanessa herself. To anyone watching this story who may be carrying guilt over a past mistake, particularly moments of lost emotional control or harm caused to others, I want to encourage you to take that guilt seriously, to seek genuine accountability and growth, the same way I eventually did following my own mistake in college. But I also want to encourage you not to live in constant fear that your past mistakes define you permanently, that genuine growth and change are not possible or meaningful, even when, as in my case, Someone else eventually chooses to weaponize your past against you in ways that feel deeply unfair given the genuine growth you've achieved. And to anyone who may be carrying their own pain from something done to them in the past, pain that might tempt you toward elaborate plans of calculated revenge, the way Vanessa pursued against me, I want to gently offer a different perspective. However justified your anger and pain may feel, and however real the harm done to you may have been, pursuing revenge that ultimately involves innocent parties, in my case, our son Ethan, who bore no responsibility whatsoever for what happened between his parents years before his birth, often creates additional harm that extends far beyond whatever satisfaction or justice the revenge itself might provide. I think, too, about what genuine healing might have looked like for Vanessa had she chosen a different path after our college years. There were, I now understand, moments along the way when she might have chosen confrontation instead of calculated deception. Moments when she might have simply told me, honestly and directly, how deeply that single afternoon had wounded her. Moments when she might have sought accountability through conversation rather than through years of careful, silent planning. I will never know whether such honesty might have led somewhere different, whether genuine dialogue between two people, years removed from a painful mistake, might have allowed for real understanding rather than calculated destruction. I only know that the path she ultimately chose, however understandable her original pain may have been, left far more devastation in its wake than it ever could have healed, touching not just my life, but her own, and most painfully, the life of a child who never asked to be part of either of our stories in the first place. I do not know if Vanessa ever found the peace she was seeking through everything she orchestrated. I hope, in whatever way is possible, that she eventually did, not because I believe she was owed peace after everything that happened, but because continued bitterness serves no one well, including those who carry it. For my part, I have found a version of peace, imperfect and hard-won, built through patience, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to being the best father I can be for Ethan, regardless of everything that came before. This channel brings you real stories of family betrayal and the difficult, complicated truths behind them. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching until the very end. See you in the next story.